Georgia clay was red, not rust red or blood red, but a deep crimson that looked like the earth itself was wounded. Liesl Hartman noticed this as her boots touched ground at 11:47 on a Thursday night in April of 1945. The truck engine died behind her. Humidity wrapped around her throat like a living thing. She had expected many things when the Americans captured her unit outside Kassel 3 weeks prior. She had expected brutality. She had expected execution. She had expected cold concrete and barbed wire cutting into skin already thin from hunger. She had not expected magnolia trees whose white blossoms glowed in darkness like ghosts. She had not expected air so thick it felt like breathing underwater. She had not expected a man in a captain's uniform to assess her with the careful neutrality of someone selecting a tool, not with hatred, not with desire, with calculation. "Inside," he said. His German carried an accent but was clear enough. "You work for me now, me. Not you're safe, not welcome, not even you're a prisoner, just you work for me." Liesl's hands trembled. They had been trembling since the ship docked in Savannah 2 days ago, since the cattle car journey that smelled of manure and diesel fuel, since the holding pen where 40 women in torn Luftwaffe gray-green huddled like animals awaiting slaughter. The trembling had not stopped. She wondered if it ever would. She climbed 3 wooden steps. The plantation house rose white against darkness, columns like bones reaching toward stars that looked wrong, brighter than Berlin, arranged in patterns she didn't recognize. Everything was foreign. Even the night sky felt like enemy territory. Somewhere distant, an owl called. The sound was alien and lonely. The door opened. Warm air rushed out, carrying the scent of real coffee and old wood and something else she couldn't name, abundance. The smell of a country that hadn't been bombed into submission. Inside, 5 men sat at makeshift desks covered in maps and filing cabinets. They looked up as she entered. One whistled low under his breath. Another said something in English she didn't catch, but the tone was clear enough. Brenneman's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Back to work." They returned to their papers, but their eyes followed her as Brenneman led her past them down a hallway lined with portraits of dead plantation owners into a room dominated by a telegraph machine and a typewriter older than she was. "You sleep there." He pointed to a cot in the corner. One thin blanket, a pillow that had seen decades of use. No door, no privacy. Just a corner of a working communications room where men would labor through the night and she would be visible always. Visible, never alone. "You don't leave this house without permission," he continued. His eyes were gray, the color of winter storms. "You speak to no one without permission. You work when I tell you. You eat when I tell you." "Understood." Liesl's throat was desert dry. She had not spoken in 3 days, not since the holding pen when she had raised her hand and changed everything. "Understood," she whispered. Brenneman nodded once. Then he left her standing there, swaying on legs that felt like water, staring at the cot that would be her entire world. The door had no lock. She noticed this immediately. It hung open to the hallway, exposing her to whatever might come. Was this a test, or simply the truth laid bare that locks were unnecessary when you had nowhere to run? She sat on the cot. The springs groaned. Outside, the owl called again. Liesl closed her eyes and tried to remember Hamburg, tried to picture her mother's face. But all she could see was rubble and fire and the telegram that had sent her to the Luftwaffe Signals Corps in the first place. "Your father killed in action, Verdun, 1917. 28 years dead and still shaping her choices." She opened her eyes. The room smelled of paper and metal and the ghost of tobacco smoke. A clock on the wall read 11:53. She had been Captain Thaddeus Brenneman's prisoner. Or was it employee for exactly 6 minutes? It felt like forever. 3 weeks earlier, Liesl had believed she understood the world. Hamburg in the winter of 1942 had been cold but righteous. Streets were clean despite rationing. Banners were red and proud. When Joseph Goebbels spoke on the radio, his voice carried the clarity of absolute truth. Germany defended civilization itself. Americans were brutes barely evolved beyond savagery, obsessed with money and jazz and moral decay. They bombed civilians, murdered children, would show no mercy if they won. Liesel's father had died at Verdun when she was 3. She remembered only the photograph on her mother's nightstand and the iron cross in its velvet box. Her mother worked the munitions plant, came home each night with yellow powder under her fingernails, never complained. When Liesel turned 18, the choice was simple: work in the factory until her lungs filled with chemicals or join the Luftwaffe as a Helferin, a helper, a girl behind the lines. They trained her on telegraph equipment. Morse code became a second language, dots and dashes more familiar than the prayers her grandmother used to whisper. She was good at it, precise, fast. She intercepted Allied communications, translated them, passed them up the chain. She told herself she was defending the Heimat, defending her mother, defending the only world she had ever known. She believed this even as the Eastern Front collapsed, even as the bombing intensified, even as girls younger than herself arrived at the signal station with hollow eyes and stories they weren't supposed to tell. She believed it until April 4, 1945, when American tanks rolled into Kassel and the officers who had promised protection simply vanished into smoke. 40 women stood with hands raised in the ruins of a train depot, Liesel among them. Some were crying, some were praying. Liesel was calculating. She had one advantage: English learned from her grandmother before the war made it illegal. Not perfect, but functional. And she knew telegraph, knew typing, knew how to make herself necessary. Survival was not cowardice. Survival was strategy. The holding pen was a converted warehouse near Savannah. Concrete floor. One bucket in the corner that overflowed by the second day. 40 women, most still in their torn uniforms, sharing 3 loaves of bread and 2 buckets of water daily. They spoke in whispers, shared rumors. The Soviets were worse, they said. The British unpredictable. The Americans, no one knew. Propaganda had been clear: Americans were barbarians. But the guard who brought bread had acne scars and couldn't have been older than 19. He looked away when they used the bucket. Was that barbarism? On the 3rd day, an officer came. Tall, thin gray eyes that scanned them like a farmer assessing livestock. "I need one woman," he said in halting German. "Must know telegraph, must know typing, must know some English." Liesel's hand went up before conscious thought could stop it. 39 pairs of eyes turned to stare, some envious, some pitying. One girl, Annalisa, whispered, "Better him than the wire." Liesel didn't understand, not then. "You," the officer said, pointing at her. "Name, Liesel Hartmann. Work experience, Luftwaffe Signals Corps, telegraph operator, 2 years. He studied her face, her hands. "Stand up." She stood. He walked closer, not threatening, just examining. "What happened to the last assistant?" Liesel asked, surprising herself with the boldness. The officer's expression didn't change. "Sent to the main camp. Couldn't keep up with the work." His tone said, "Don't ask more questions." He gestured toward the door. "Get your things." Liesel had no things, just the uniform she wore and the knowledge that she had just made a choice that couldn't be unmade. As the truck pulled away, Annalisa watched from behind the wire. Her lips moved. Liesel couldn't hear the words but knew what they were. "Good luck. You'll need it." The first meal nearly killed her. Brenneman brought it himself that first night, a plate piled with food she didn't recognize. Fried chicken, golden and glistening with grease. Cornbread that crumbled at the slightest touch. Something green boiled with pieces of meat. And a glass of amber liquid that smelled sweet enough to rot teeth. "Eat," he said. Not an invitation. An order. Liesel stared. She had not seen this much food in 2 years, not even before rationing became severe. Her stomach shrunken from 9 days at sea on ship biscuits and thin gruel cramped at the sight. She took a bite of chicken. The grease coated her tongue. Rich, overwhelming, impossibly abundant. She made it to the bucket before the vomiting started. It came in waves, her body rejecting this sudden wealth the way a drought-starved field rejects flooding rain. She knelt on the floor, gasping and humiliated, tasting bile and failure. Brenneman watched from the doorway, silent. When she finally stopped, when she knelt there shaking and ashamed, he brought a damp cloth, set it beside her without a word, took the plate away. An hour later, he returned with plain broth, chicken stock with nothing in it, a piece of dry bread. "Slow," he said. His voice was not unkind, just factual. "You'll live." She drank the broth in tiny sips, held the bread in her mouth until it softened to paste, swallowed carefully, kept it down, barely. That night, lying on the cot in the corner of the communications room, she listened to him in the office next door, pacing, back and forth, back and forth. The sound of a drawer opening, something heavy being lifted, a photograph perhaps, then the drawer closing with careful softness. A chair scraping, silence that felt full of ghosts. She stared at the ceiling where water stains bloomed like dark flowers and wondered what kind of man brought broth to an enemy who had just vomited on his floor. Morning came with the smell of real coffee, not the acorn substitute her mother drank in Hamburg, not the chicory blend the Luftwaffe served. Real coffee that smelled like every promise of normalcy the world had broken. Brenneman set a cup on the desk beside the typewriter. Steam rose in lazy spirals. "Work starts at 6, he said. "You type what I dictate. You translate German intercepts. You send telegraph messages when ordered. You speak to no one about what you hear in this room. Understood." Understood. He handed her a stack of papers, intelligence reports, troop movements, supply requisitions. His handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, the penmanship of someone who had learned early that sloppiness could kill. She rolled paper into the typewriter, a Remington that had seen better decades, keys worn smooth by thousands of previous reports, and began. The rhythm was familiar. Click-clack, ding, return, click-clack. Her fingers found the pattern they had learned in Hamburg when the world still made a kind of terrible sense. Brenneman sat at his own desk reviewing maps marked with red and blue arrows that told the story of Germany's collapse in symbols and lines. He didn't speak, didn't look at her. The silence stretched like wire pulled too tight. At noon he brought her grits white paste that smelled of nothing and tasted of less. She ate it because she had learned plain food stayed down. Rich food was betrayal. At 6 in the evening he said, "Enough." She had typed 47 pages. He locked them in a filing cabinet, pocketed the key, and pointed to the cot. "Sleep." But she didn't sleep. She lay rigid, listening to the house settle, listening to him pace next door, listening to the drawer open and close like a heartbeat that couldn't find its rhythm. Outside, the owl called, a lonely sound in a country that had no idea what loneliness meant. Not like Germany knew it, with half its cities turned to ash, and its men dead in Russian snow. Liesel counted ceiling stains. 47. She would count them many times in the weeks to come. Small continents in a white plaster ocean mapping a geography of captivity. 3 days passed this way. Type, eat, listen. Sleep came in fragments, never deep, always with one part of her brain alert for footsteps that might mean danger or rescue or something worse than either. On the 4th day, she asked her first question. "Captain Brenneman." He looked up from a map of the Rhineland where red arrows showed Allied advance and blue retreats showed German collapse. Raised an eyebrow. "Why me?" The question hung in the air between them. She watched him consider it, weigh his answer, choose truth or evasion. "You raised your hand," he said finally. "So did Annalisa. Annalisa doesn't know Morse code." "How did you know I do?" A slight smile tugged at his mouth, barely visible. "Your fingers, while you were waiting in the pen, tapping on your knee, SOS, over and over." Liesel's breath caught. She hadn't realized. Muscle memory betraying her, her fingers automatically drumming out the universal distress signal while her conscious mind tried to appear calm. "You were nervous," Brenneman continued, "but trained. I need trained, not scared." "I am scared. I know." He returned to his map. The conversation was over as far as he was concerned. But something had shifted. The smallest crack in the wall between captor and captive. Not trust would take longer if it ever came, but acknowledgement. She was not just a body filling a role. She was a person he had noticed. It was the most dangerous thing that could have happened. The other men in the house existed as shadows to her. She learned their ranks from shoulder patches, but never their names. They looked at her the way men looked at women in wartime, assessing, calculating, wondering what could be taken and at what cost. But Brenneman's presence was a wall. When he was in the room, they kept their distance. When he left, their eyes followed her movements. Once a corporal young with a scar bisecting his chin stood too close while she retrieved a file from the cabinet. "You speak English?" he asked. Liesel kept her eyes down, remembered the rules. "Captain Brenneman says I should not speak to—" "I'm not asking what the captain says, I'm asking if you speak English." She felt his breath on her neck, smelled tobacco and something sour underneath the smell of a man who hadn't bathed properly in days. The door opened. Brenneman filled the frame backlit by hallway light so his face was shadowed. "Corporal Davies?" The young man stepped back immediately, spine straightening. "Sir? Your shift ended 10 minutes ago." "Yes, sir. Just leaving, sir." Davies left quickly, not quite running, but close. Brenneman watched him go, then turned to Liesel. His expression was neutral, but his jaw was tight. "You speak to him. He spoke to me. And you answered. I told him, you said, next time don't answer at all. Don't acknowledge. Don't respond. Understood?" "Yes, Captain." He left without another word. Liesel stood there, hands shaking again, always shaking when adrenaline spiked, and understood something fundamental. She was not protected in the way a person is protected. She was protected the way property is protected. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. On the 7th day, the Red Cross truck arrived. Liesel was typing when she heard it, the engine's distinctive rumble, the squeal of brakes, voices outside in English too rapid to follow. Brenneman went out to meet them. Through the window, she watched him sign papers, accept boxes stacked in the truck bed. Mail, supplies, the lifeline connecting this Georgia plantation to a wider world that was slowly, painfully reshaping itself. When Brenneman returned, he carried a single envelope. Thin paper, Hamburg postmark, 6 months old, her mother's handwriting. Liesel stood so fast her chair tipped backward with a clatter. Her hands reached without permission, without thought. Brenneman held the letter just out of reach. "Work first," he said. His voice was quiet but absolute. "You read when work is done." It was a violation. It was power made visible. The clearest possible statement: nothing here belongs to you, not even letters from your mother. But it was also something else. She saw it in the way his fingers tightened on the envelope, in the tightness around his eyes. Hesitation, as if he too was uncertain where the line should be drawn between necessary control and unnecessary cruelty. "Please," she heard herself say, the first time she had begged since arriving. He looked at the envelope, looked at her. The moment stretched like a wire pulled to breaking. 6 hours, he said finally. "Then you can read it." He placed the letter on his desk where she could see it but not reach it. A cruelty or a kindness or both at once. Liesel sat back down, rolled fresh paper into the typewriter with hands that were steady now because rage was an anchor. Rage kept you upright when fear wanted you on your knees. She typed for 6 hours without pause, without error. Each keystroke a small act of defiance against the man who held her mother's words hostage. When the clock struck 8, Brenneman wordlessly handed her the envelope. She took it to her cot, sat with her back to the room, to the men who pretended not to watch. Opened it with fingers that had forgotten gentleness. Inside 2 pages in her mother's neat, careful script. The date, October 1944, 5 months ago. An eternity ago. "My dearest Liesel, I do not know if this will reach you. The Red Cross says they will try. The bombing has been terrible. Frau Weber's house is gone entirely, she and her daughters with it. The Muellers disappeared after the last raid. I am still at the plant, though production has slowed to almost nothing. There is not much food. I think of you every day and pray you are somewhere safe, even if that somewhere is far from me. If you are reading this, you are alive. That is enough. That is everything. Come home when you can. I will be waiting. Your Mutti Liesel read it 3 times. Each word was a knife twisting. Her mother was alive in October, but it was now April. 6 months. Anything could have happened in 6 months. Hamburg was being bombed. She knew this from the intelligence reports she typed daily. Firestorms, incendiaries, whole neighborhoods erased from existence. She folded the letter with careful precision, placed it under her pillow, lay down facing the wall so no one would see her cry. Behind her, the telegraph machine chattered its endless conversation of dots and dashes. The typewriter dinged as someone else used it. Men spoke in low voices about supply lines and troop movements, and the war that everyone knew was ending, but that kept grinding forward anyway. And in the office next door, a drawer opened. A photograph was lifted, set down. The drawer closed with that same careful softness. A man she didn't know guarding a grief she couldn't see while she guarded her own. 2 prisoners, one with bars, one without, both trying to survive a war that had already taken everything that mattered. 2 weeks into her captivity, or was it employment? She still couldn't decide which word fit. Liesel began to notice patterns. Brenneman ate the same breakfast every morning, black coffee toast with no butter, 1 egg. He read reports while he ate, made notes in precise margins, never wasted a single motion. At 10 each morning, he stepped outside, exactly 15 minutes. Always the same duration. Once, watching through the window, she saw him standing by the magnolia tree, smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing visible, just standing, as if he had forgotten how to be still indoors. At 3 in the afternoon, he brought her weak tea, set it beside the typewriter without comment. The first time she thought it was a mistake meant for someone else. But he did it every day. Same chipped cup, same time, small rituals in chaos, anchors in a flood. She learned his moods by the set of his shoulders. Tension meant bad news from the front. Stillness meant routine paperwork. The rare looseness, shoulders dropped, jaw unclenched, meant something had gone right, some intelligence had proven useful, some small victory in the larger defeat. She learned he had served in North Africa before this. Saw the scars on his hands from desert sand that got into everything. Noticed how he squinted in bright light even though Georgia's sun was nothing compared to Sahara. She learned he was 36. Unmarried according to the others, though that wasn't quite accurate. She had seen the drawer, had heard him cry that one night. Something had happened, someone had been lost, but he guarded that story like classified intelligence. And slowly, carefully, like a prisoner learning the dimensions of her cell, she began to understand the shape of her cage. It had no bars, but it had boundaries. She could walk to the kitchen for water, could step onto the porch for air in the evening, could speak when spoken to, could ask for small things if she phrased them as requests rather than demands. Could not leave the house, could not write letters, could not contact other POWs, could not refuse orders. Was this protection or possession, safety or slavery with a gentler face? She didn't know, and Brenneman with his gray eyes and his locked drawer and his 3 o'clock tea wasn't telling. At the end of the 3rd week, another officer arrived, Major somebody. Liesel didn't catch the full name. He wore more ribbons than Brenneman, spoke louder, laughed at his own jokes with the confidence of a man who had never been told to quiet down. He saw Liesel typing and stopped mid-sentence. Well, Brenneman's got himself a housefrau. Liesel's English had improved enough to catch the tone, if not the exact translation. She kept typing, eyes on the keys, willing herself invisible. The major walked closer, leaned against her desk, too close, invading the small bubble of space she had claimed as her own. She speak English. Some, Brenneman said. His voice was flat, empty of inflection. Pretty little thing. Where'd you find her? Savannah holding pen. She's qualified personnel. I bet she is. The major smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. What else does she do besides type? The room went silent. Even the telegraph stopped its chatter as if the machine itself was holding its breath. Brenneman stood slowly. His hand didn't move toward his sidearm, but the possibility hung in the air like smoke. She types, he said. Each word was carved from ice. She translates, she operates telegraph equipment, that's all. Easy, Captain. Just making conversation. Make it elsewhere. The major raised his hands in mock surrender. Laughed, but it sounded forced. Didn't mean to step on your territory. She's not territory, she's personnel. Right, personnel. Another ugly smile. Just remember to file the proper paperwork. He left. The door closed. The room exhaled. Liesel's hands hovered over the typewriter keys, frozen mid-word. Brenneman returned to his desk, picked up his pen as if nothing had happened. But she had heard the edge in his voice when he said, she's personnel. Not she's a person. Not she's under my protection. Personnel. A thing that belonged to the unit, to the mission, to him. That night, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him in the next room. Not pacing this time, just sitting. The drawer opened, the photograph lifted, and then so quietly she almost missed it. I don't know what I'm doing, Clara. A name. Finally a name to attach to the grief. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. The photograph went back. The drawer closed. Silence consumed everything. Liesel lay motionless in her cot, eyes open in darkness, and understood she wasn't the only one trapped here. Brenneman was caught in something too, a grief that had no resolution, a loss that had left him hollow and desperate to fill the emptiness with something. Duty control the illusion of purpose. Two prisoners, one with visible bars, one with invisible ones, both trying to survive in the aftermath of different wars. Morning came too soon, as it always did. The sky lightened from black to gray to the harsh white of Georgia spring. Liesel rose, washed her face in the basin, braided her hair with fingers that had learned efficiency over beauty. Brenneman was already at his desk when she emerged. He handed her a new stack of reports without looking up. The routine absorbed her like water. But something had changed. She knew his wife's name now, Clara, and knowing it made him more human, which made everything more complicated. Because it's easier to hate a jailer than to pity one. And Liesel was beginning to suspect that pity might be more dangerous than hate. The work became routine before Liesel noticed it happening. Wake at 5:30. Wash face in cold water from the basin that someone, probably Brenneman, refilled each night. Braid hair tight enough to last 12 hours without coming loose. He was already at his desk when she emerged, coffee cooling in its usual cup, the day's stack of intercepts waiting like accusations. She learned to read desperation in German military transmissions the way a doctor reads fever in flushed skin. April became May. The intercepts grew more frantic, units requesting permission to retreat, commanders asking for orders that no longer came from a high command that had stopped commanding. Once she translated a message that was just 3 letters repeated endlessly, hill, 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 help, help, help. No call sign, no coordinates. Just a voice screaming into the void. She brought it to Brenneman. He read it, filed it without comment. What was there to say? The war was ending. Everyone knew it. But knowing and accepting were different animals entirely. On May 7th, a lieutenant burst into the communications room at 1600 hours. Sir, wire from Eisenhower's headquarters. Brenneman took the telegram, read it twice, face showing nothing. What is it? Liesel asked. He handed her the paper without a word. German High Command surrenders unconditionally. Stop effective. 23:01 hours, 8 May 1945. Stop war in Europe concluded. Stop. Her hands holding the paper were steady. That surprised her. She had imagined this moment would bring tears, relief, collapse. Instead, there was only a strange hollowness. Germany had lost. She had known it was coming, had helped make it come faster with every translation, every intercepted message decoded and delivered to men who used that information to kill German soldiers more efficiently. And now it was over. What happens to me? The question came out smaller than she intended. Brenneman took the telegram back, refolded it with precise creases. Repatriation, eventually. The paperwork will take months, maybe years. How many months? I don't know. Will I go back to Germany or? That hasn't been decided yet. Displaced persons camps, probably. Until they can verify identities, arrange transport, figure out what to do with several 100,000 people who suddenly have nowhere to go. He was looking at her now, really looking. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something like uncertainty in those gray eyes. "You'll stay here until then," he said. "Orders are to maintain current assignments until formal repatriation structure is established." Current assignments. She was an assignment. Personnel. The thing the major had smirked about. "How long?" she asked again, knowing he had already answered but needing to hear it confirmed. "As long as it takes." That night, celebrations erupted across the base. She heard them through the window, men laughing. Someone playing harmonica badly, bottles clinking in toasts. To victory and survival and the end of dying. The kind of celebration that came mixed with relief and guilt in equal measure because winning meant others lost and losing meant someone's mother was buried in rubble somewhere. Brenneman didn't join them. He sat at his desk until past midnight, working through files as if nothing fundamental had changed. Maybe for him nothing had. The war ending didn't bring back what he had lost. Liesel lay on her cot and counted ceiling stains. 47. She had them memorized by now. Small brown continents in a white plaster ocean, each one a landmark in the geography of captivity. Germany had surrendered, but she was still here, still trapped between walls that had no bars but were walls nonetheless. The war was over. Hers was just beginning. May became June. Heat intensified. Georgia's summer arrived like a physical presence, not just temperature but humidity so thick it pressed against the skin like wet cloth. Liesel learned that this was different from rain. Rain at least had the decency to fall and be done. Humidity just hung there, making every breath work, every movement feel like pushing through invisible resistance. The routine expanded. Brenneman arranged a work detail. Female POWs could volunteer for agricultural labor on nearby farms. Easier duty than the camps, better food, something to do besides sit behind wire counting days until bureaucracy decided your fate. "You'll go," he told Liesel. Not asked, told. "Where but farm 3 miles east. Dairy operation. Owner needs help with spring work. You'll go mornings, return by 1400 hours for translation work." She wanted to argue, wanted to ask why she had to do both, but the answer was obvious: because she could, because she was useful in 2 ways instead of 1. Because in this new peacetime that felt nothing like peace value was survival and uselessness was risk. The farm belonged to a man named Horace Garrett. 70 years old, spine bent from 5 decades of labor, hands like tree roots, gnarled and impossible to straighten fully. His son had died at Anzio, his grandson at Normandy. When he looked at the German POWs assigned to help him, his eyes held too much grief to leave room for hate. "You know cows?" he asked Liesel in English that drawled slow as honey. "No, sir." "Well, you about to learn." He wheezed out something that might have been a laugh. "Follow me." The dairy barn smelled of hay and manure and warm milk, earthy smells that were nothing like the chemical stink of Hamburg's munitions plant or the antiseptic sterility of the Luftwaffe Communications Center. Holsteins swayed in their stalls, enormous and placid, their sides rising and falling with breath that seemed too slow, too calm for creatures that large. Liesel had never been this close to an animal bigger than a dog. When one turned its massive head to look at her with dark, unreadable eyes, she stepped back involuntarily. Garrett laughed again, the sound turning into a wet cough he had to spit out. "They ain't gonna hurt you. More scared of you than you are of them, probably." "I doubt that," Liesel muttered in German, then caught herself. I mean, I doubt it, sir. Brenneman, who had driven her here and was leaning against the barn doorway watching, made a sound that might have been amusement. The first time she'd heard anything close to laughter from him. Garrett demonstrated milking, the rhythm of it. Pull and squeeze, warm streams hitting the tin bucket in steady percussion that echoed in the barn. Your turn, he said, standing with difficulty and gesturing to the stool. Liesel knelt on the three-legged stool that rocked slightly on uneven ground, reached for the udder. The cow shifted weight. She froze. She knows you're nervous, Garrett said. Animals know, same as people. You gotta commit or get out the way. Liesel closed her hands around the teat. It was warm, almost hot, covered in coarse hair. She pulled. Nothing happened. Pulled again. A pathetic dribble. Behind her, Brenneman's voice. Firmer. Like you mean it. She glanced back, annoyed. I do mean it. Then show the cow. She gripped harder, pulled with actual force instead of tentative hope. A stream of milk hit the bucket, then another. The rhythm came not smooth yet, but present. Pull, squeeze, the barn filled with the sound of success, however small. There you go, Garrett said, nodding approval. Natural. Nothing about this was natural. But Liesel didn't say that. She just kept pulling, kept squeezing until the bucket was half full and her forearms burned. When Garrett declared her passable, she stood on shaky legs. The cow looked at her with what might have been disdain or might have been nothing. Cows were impossible to read. On the truck ride back to the plantation house, Brenneman said, You did well. Liesel looked at her hands. They smelled of milk and cow and something earthy she couldn't name. I milked a cow. It's hardly skilled labor. No, but you didn't run when it scared you. She wanted to say, where would I run to? But the words felt too honest, too revealing of the truth they both knew and never spoke. Instead, your son, the one who was scared of animals, how old was he? The silence stretched so long she thought he wouldn't answer. The truck hit a pothole and she grabbed the rail to steady herself. Then quietly, 8. He was 8. We took him to a farm once before the war, before everything. He cried when we tried to get him near the horses. Wouldn't go within 10 feet. Did he get over it? Never got the chance. His voice was flat, but something underneath it wasn't. Diphtheria. Took him in about 36 hours. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Everyone was sick that winter. My wife Clara, she tried everything. Sat by his bed for 3 days straight. When he died, she just stopped eating, stopped talking. 2 weeks later, she was gone too. Pneumonia, the doctor said, but I think she just decided she didn't want to be here without him. The truck rumbled on. Liesel didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know if there were words for that particular shape of loss. Finally, I'm sorry. Yeah. He didn't look at her. Me too. The moment closed like a door. But she had glimpsed what was behind it, a man who had lost his entire family while he was across an ocean shooting at people who probably had families too. A man who watched a German girl learn to milk cows and saw what might have been if the world had been different. She was not his daughter, could never be his daughter. But she was someone's daughter. And in the mathematics of grief, maybe proximity was enough when nothing else was possible. The other POWs began to notice her special status. Liesel returned to the temporary women's barracks each afternoon at 1400 hours, just long enough to wash and change clothes before heading back to the plantation for translation work. The other women, 12 of them, mostly former Luftwaffe auxiliaries like herself, watched with eyes that calculated and judged. Where do you go at night? One asked. Greta, not the Greta from Hamburg, a different one from Munich with hard eyes and harder questions. Back to headquarters, translation work. Just translation. The implication hung heavy as summer humidity. Liesel felt her face flush. Yes, just translation. Must be convenient, another woman said. Frida, 24. Visibly pregnant, though whether the father was a German soldier or an American guard, she wouldn't say. Private quarters, hot meals, personal protection. It's work. I didn't ask for it. None of us ask for anything, Greta said, voice sharp as wire. But some of us get offered things anyway. Funny how that works. Liesel understood then. To them she was Brenneman's kept woman. His pet. The girl who had traded one thing for another in the oldest transaction war had ever known. The fact that it wasn't true didn't matter. The appearance was enough. And maybe she thought uncomfortably, maybe the appearance wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe the line between being protected and being kept was thinner than she wanted to admit. She stopped trying to explain after that. Let them think what they wanted. It was easier than the truth, which was more complicated than simple transaction. She didn't know what she and Brenneman were to each other. Didn't know if there was even a word for it. Captor and captive, yes. Officer and personnel, certainly. But also two people trapped in roles neither had chosen, making the best of a situation that had no good options. At night, lying on her cot in the communications room, she listened to him pace in the next room. Some nights he drank, she could hear the bottle, the glass, the liquid pouring. Never enough to be drunk, Brenneman was too controlled for that, but enough to soften the edges of whatever he was trying not to feel. Once, very late, she heard him crying. She lay completely still, barely breathing. The sound was quiet, controlled even in breakdown, a man trying not to make noise and failing. It lasted maybe 3 minutes. Then silence. Then the drawer opening. The photograph of Clara and the dead 8-year-old boy. The drawer closing. In the morning, his face showed nothing. She never mentioned it. Some griefs were too private to acknowledge, even when you heard them through walls. June became July. The work continued: farm in the morning, translation in the afternoon, typing in the evening. The routine carved grooves in her days until they all looked the same, a blur of cow smells and telegraph codes and Brenneman's careful silences. But there were moments, small breaks in the pattern that stood out precisely because they were different. Garrett teaching her to drive the tractor her first time behind any kind of wheel, the machine lurching forward while he laughed his wheezy laugh, and Brenneman watched from the truck with something almost like a smile. A thunderstorm that knocked out power for 2 hours. Sitting in darkness while Brenneman lit candles, the communications room transformed into something almost intimate. Neither of them speaking. Just rain hammering the roof and candles throwing shadows that made the walls move and breathe. The first letter she was allowed to send. Brenneman presented the paper and envelope one evening in late July, like it was a gift and a test at once. Red Cross approved outgoing mail, 1 page, nothing about military operations, nothing about location, understood. She wrote to her mother, told her she was alive, fed, safe. The lies felt necessary. What else could she say? That she was prisoner to a man she couldn't hate and couldn't trust. That she collaborated daily in Germany's defeat and felt both guilt and relief. That she didn't know if she wanted to go home because home was rubble and here at least there were meals and work and something like purpose. She wrote, "I am well. I think of you always. I will come home when I can." Brenneman read it before sealing the envelope. She watched his eyes track across her careful words, looking for what coded messages. Evidence of loyalty or disloyalty, or just curiosity about what prisoners wrote to the people they'd left behind. He sealed it without comment, stamped it, added it to the outgoing mail pouch. "Will it reach her?" Liesel asked. "Maybe, if she's still at the same address, if the Red Cross can find her, if Hamburg's postal system still functions." He paused. "That's a lot of ifs. War is built from ifs." He looked at her, then really looked as if seeing something he hadn't noticed before. "Yes, it is." She thought about that later. War is built from ifs. If Germany had won at Stalingrad, if America had stayed neutral, if her father hadn't died at Verdun, if Brenneman's son hadn't caught diphtheria, if his wife hadn't given up and died too, if Liesel hadn't raised her hand in that holding pen. Every life was a chain of ifs leading to a present that felt inevitable but was actually nothing but luck and timing and 10,000 small choices that could have gone differently. August brought new tension. Male POWs from a camp 15 miles south were brought in for agricultural work. Not auxiliaries like the women, these were proper Wehrmacht. Combat soldiers, some of them. Men who had fought on the Eastern Front and survived, which meant they were either very lucky or very hard or both. They worked the larger farms, slept in guarded barracks, and carried with them the kind of fanaticism that didn't die just because the war was officially over. Liesel saw them once when Brenneman drove past their work detail. 30 men sunburned and thin, digging irrigation ditches in heat that would have killed softer men. One of them looked up as the truck passed, saw her sitting in the passenger seat. He spat. The gesture was small but unmistakable. Traitor. She saw it in his eyes even though she couldn't hear the word over the engine noise. That evening, returning from the dairy farm later than usual, a cow had been sick. Needed tending. Liesel walked across the darkening yard toward the plantation house. Summer air was thick with cicadas and the smell of cut grass drying in humidity. 3 men stepped out from behind the equipment shed. German. Wehrmacht. She recognized 2 from the work detail. Fräulein Hartmann, one said. His accent was Bavarian, the words clipped with mountain hardness. Working late for the Americans. She stopped, calculated distances. The house was 50 meters away, too far to run. The guard post was closer, but she could see through the fence, empty during shift change. I'm assigned here, she said, kept her voice level, showing no fear even though her heart was trying to break through her ribs. Assigned, he laughed without humor. Is that what they call it now? The other 2 spread out, not threatening yet, just positioning. She knew that dance from years of watching men establish dominance in cramped quarters. You should be in the barracks with the other whores, the Bavarian said, stepping closer. Not playing secretary for the enemy. I'm not playing anything. I work, just like you. We work because we're forced. You collaborate. His voice rose. How many German soldiers died because of intelligence you translated? How many? The war is over. The war is never over. He was shouting now. Germany surrendered, but we didn't. Some of us remember what loyalty means, what honor means. She saw his hand moving, saw the flash of metal, a knife small, probably stolen from the kitchen detail where they worked. Then a voice cut through the darkness. Cold, absolute. Step away from her, now! Brenneman stood on the plantation house porch, sidearm drawn. Not pointed yet, hanging at his side, but the threat was unmistakable. The Bavarian hesitated. This is German business, Captain. This is American property. She's under my command. You have 3 seconds to step back before I shoot you where you stand. For a moment, Liesel thought they would charge anyway. Thought the fanaticism would override survival instinct. But Brenneman cocked the pistol. The sound was very loud in the evening quiet. They moved, backed away slowly, hands visible. The Bavarian glared at her one more time. Whore, he hissed. Whore. Then they melted into shadows, gone. Brenneman crossed the yard in quick strides, grabbed Liesel's arm, not gently but not brutal either. Inside, now! She let herself be pulled, legs shaking with adrenaline and delayed fear. Inside the communications room, he finally holstered the weapon. Did they touch you? No. You came before. Did they touch you at all? No. He nodded, released her arm, paced to the window. Back. Window again. Energy that had nowhere to go. You can't work the farm anymore, he said finally. What? No. You need to stay alive. Those men are hardline, true believers. They'll try again. Then post guards. I can't spare guards to protect one POW doing agricultural labor. He turned to face her. You stay here. Full time. Translation only. No more leaving the compound. That's not fair. Fair. His voice rose for the first time since she'd met him. Actually rose. You want fair is you dead in a ditch because I let you wander around exposed to men who think killing you would be doing Germany a service. Is that what you want? I want to not be a prisoner. You are a prisoner. He shouted it. The words echoed in the small room, then stopped. Seemed shocked at his own volume. Silence fell like something physical. Liesel felt tears hot behind her eyes, refused to let them fall. She had not cried in front of him yet and wouldn't start now. Brenneman sat down slowly, put his head in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost broken. My son was 8 years old when he died. I was in North Africa. Couldn't get home in time. My wife died 2 weeks later. The grief killed her as sure as any disease. When the war ended in Europe, when I thought maybe I could stop watching people die, they sent me here. Gave me prisoners to manage, gave me you. He looked up. His eyes were wet. I don't know what you are to me. I don't know if I'm protecting you or keeping you or something else I don't have words for. But I know that if those men had killed you tonight, if I had let that happen. He stopped, swallowed hard. I can't lose someone else. I can't. Do you understand? I physically cannot survive losing someone else I was supposed to protect. Liesel stood frozen. This was the truth under everything, not possession, not even protection in any clean sense. Desperation, a man so hollowed by loss that he clung to whatever he could keep safe, regardless of whether that safety was wanted or needed or right. You can't keep me, she said softly. I'm not yours to keep. I know, but you'll try anyway. Yes. No hesitation, no apology. She should have been angry, should have raged against this prison built from grief instead of wire. But standing there looking at this man who had brought her broth when she was sick and taught her the rhythm of work and held a gun to protect her from her own countrymen, she felt something more complicated than anger. Then keep me, she heard herself say. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. If that's what you need to survive, keep me, until you can let me go. Brenneman's face crumpled. He nodded once, unable to speak. That night he moved her cot, not out of the communications room that would violate the proprieties he still clung to like a drowning man clings to driftwood, but to the far corner furthest from the door, less visible, more protected, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he locked the main door at night. She was safer now. She was also more trapped. The line between the two had vanished entirely, if it had ever existed at all. September arrived with cooler air and news that displaced persons camps were being established throughout occupied Germany. Repatriation would begin, slowly, systematically. Perhaps by year's end, they said, though no one seemed certain. Liesel received her first reply from Hamburg in mid-September. The envelope was water-damaged, stamp smudged, nearly illegible, but inside her mother's handwriting was still careful and clear. My dearest Liesel, your letter reached me. I cried for 3 hours when the Red Cross worker brought it. You are alive. That is everything. Hamburg is unrecognizable. Our street is completely gone, not just damaged, gone. Erased. I live with Frau Eckhart now in Bromseli. Her son died in Russia. We keep each other from going entirely mad. The British are fair but distant. There is never enough food. We survive on rations and what we can scavenge. But we survive. Come home if you can. But if America is safer if you have work and food there, then stay. I want you alive more than I want you here. Do you understand? I want you alive. Your Mutti Liesel read it 5 times. Each time the words rearranged themselves in her head. Stay if America is safer, permission. Her mother giving her permission to not come home, to choose survival over loyalty, life over duty. Brenneman found her that evening staring at the letter, not translating, not working, just staring. Bad news? He asked. No. Good news. She's alive. Then why do you look like that? Liesel folded the letter carefully, creasing it along lines that were already worn from multiple readings. She told me to stay here if it's safer, to not come home. Is it safer? I don't know. She looked up at him. Is it? He sat down across from her at the work table. For a long moment he said nothing, just looked at his hands like they might have answers written on the calluses. Hamburg is starving, he said finally. Allied occupation is complicated. The British are trying to maintain order, but there's not enough food, not enough medicine, not enough anything. There's work here, food here. You could apply for immigration after repatriation. Come back properly. As what? War bride, displaced person, employee. Does it matter? It matters to me. He nodded slowly, poured 2 glasses of whiskey without asking permission, slid one across to her. I could sponsor you, he said. Didn't look at her while saying it. Once you're formally repatriated, bring you back as civilian employee, secretary, telegraph operator, something legitimate. Why would you do that? Now he looked at her. Because I don't want you to go. The honesty of it was brutal, no pretense of duty, no hiding behind regulations or military necessity. Just the raw truth, I don't want you to go. That's not a reason, she said, though her voice was softer than she intended. It's the only reason I have. Outside night had fallen completely. Through the window, stars emerged one by one, different stars than Hamburg's stars arranged in constellations. She still didn't recognize even after months of seeing them. Liesel thought about her mother in the ruins, thought about the knife that might have found her if Brenneman had been slower, thought about cows and typewriters and a man who cried when he thought no one could hear. If I stayed, she said carefully, it wouldn't be like this. I wouldn't be a prisoner. No. I'd have my own room, my own money, my own life. Yes. And you'd have to let me go if I wanted to leave. His jaw tightened visibly. Yes. Say it. Promise me. I promise. She didn't know if she believed him, didn't know if he believed himself, but the offer was there. A door cracked open in a wall that had seemed solid. I'll think about it, she said. That night, lying on her cot, she heard him in the next room. Not crying this time, just the drawer opening. But instead of closing after a moment like usual, it stayed open, as if maybe finally he was ready to stop hiding from his ghosts. Or maybe just ready to let them have company. In the darkness, Liesel closed her eyes and tried to imagine futures. Tried to see herself back in Hamburg, tried to feel what home would mean. But all she could picture was rubble and hunger and neighbors who would always see her as the girl who ate American food while they starved. Then she tried to imagine staying. Tried to see herself in this Georgia heat, working for a man who couldn't let go, building a life from the pieces of someone else's broken one. Neither future felt right, neither felt possible. But one of them would happen anyway because time only moved forward and choices had to be made even when all the choices were terrible. She would have to choose soon. The question was whether she could live with the answer. On the last day of September, Brenneman gave her a package wrapped in brown paper. What is this? She asked. Open it. Inside, wool gloves, child-sized but worn, stretched from use. The kind of gloves a boy might have worn on a farm visit before the war, before diphtheria, before everything ended. They were my son's, Brenneman said quietly. Last thing he touched before we took him to the hospital. Clara wanted to keep them. After she died, I kept them. Thought maybe... He stopped, started again. I want you to have them. Liesel looked at the gloves. They were too small for her hands, but she understood this wasn't about fit. This was about trust, about letting someone else hold the most precious remnant of a life that had ended too soon. I can't take these, she whispered. Yes, you can. I'm giving them to you, for when winter comes. He paused. For when you decide, stay or go. Either way, you should have something warm. She held the gloves like they might break, like they were made of spun glass instead of wool. Thank you, she managed. He nodded, turned to go, stopped at the door. Liesel, yes. Whatever you choose, I'll understand. He left before she could respond. That night, she placed the gloves under her pillow next to her mother's letters. 2 sets of words from 2 different worlds, both saying in their own way, survive. Choose life. Do what you have to do. She fell asleep holding them both. December came to Georgia with cold that wasn't quite cold. Not like Hamburg winters where ice formed on window interiors and breath crystallized midair. Just a thin chill that made mornings require a sweater and evenings a blanket. Comfortable cold, survivable cold, the kind that reminded you winter existed without trying to kill you. Liesel had been at the plantation house for 8 months, 243 days. She had stopped counting after 200, but the number was there anyway, carved into her consciousness like marks on a cell wall. The repatriation orders arrived December 3rd, formal this time. Official stamps and signatures and dates that couldn't be argued with. All German POWs to be processed through displaced persons camps by January 31st, 1946. Transport would be arranged. Destinations assigned based on last known address. Brenneman read the orders twice before handing them to her without comment. January, he said. Yes, Hamburg. That's where my mother is. He nodded. Set the papers on his desk with careful precision, aligning them exactly with the desk edge. A habit she'd learned meant he was thinking, preparing to say something difficult. You don't have to go, he said finally. The orders can be delayed. Medical reasons, essential personnel. I can file paperwork to extend your stay. To keep me prisoner longer. The words came out sharper than she intended. To give you a choice. He turned to face her. To give you time to make the choice that's right for you, not the one the army decides for you. What choice? Though she already knew. Had known since September, really, when he'd given her his dead son's gloves. Brenneman stood, walked to the window, spoke with his back to her silhouette against pale winter light. Stay. Not like this, not as prisoner. I'll process your repatriation officially. Send you through the camps. Get you cleared properly. Then sponsor your return. War bride visa or employment or refugee status, whatever works. You'd have your own place, your own money. You could work as civilian translator for the base, real job, real pay, real life. Why? Though she knew this answer too. I told you why in September. Tell me again. He turned. His face was carefully neutral, but his eyes were not. Because in 8 months you're the first person I've talked to who wasn't about the war or the dead or orders from people who don't understand what it's like here. Because you make terrible coffee and milk cows like you're defusing bombs, and I can hear you cry quietly enough that you think I won't notice. Because my wife is dead and my son is dead, and I spent 3 years in a desert watching boys die for reasons that made sense at the time and don't make sense now. Because you're alive. You're here. And I don't want you to go back into that. He gestured vaguely eastward toward Europe, toward the ruins, into that graveyard. Pretending to be a country. Liesel felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, opening, enough to let in air that had been trapped too long. That's not love, she said. I know. That's need, desperation. Yes, need isn't enough to build a life on. I know that too. He sat down slowly, looking older than 36. But it's what I have. So I'm asking anyway. Stay, come back. Whatever you want to call it, just don't disappear into Germany and never come back. She should have been angry, should have thrown the manipulation back in his face, because it was manipulation, even if it was honest manipulation, even if he was laying all his cards on the table and letting her see exactly how desperate he was. But she had learned something in 8 months. Brenneman didn't manipulate. He stated facts with brutal honesty and let her decide. The honesty was worse than manipulation because manipulation could be fought. Honesty just sat there, unavoidable. I need to see my mother, she said. I know. I need to see Hamburg, see what's left, see if there's anything to come back to. I understand. I can't promise I'll return. His hands tightened on the desk edge until his knuckles went white. I'm not asking for promises, I'm asking you to think about it, to consider the possibility, that's all. She thought about it that night, and the next night, and every night for the following 2 weeks. Thought about her mother alone in a ruined city, keeping herself alive through will and the charity of a stranger whose son was dead in Russia. Thought about Hamburg, the harbor where her father used to take her on Sundays before he died, the park where she'd learned to ride a bicycle. The apartment building that was probably rubble now collapsed into itself like a promise broken. Thought about Georgia, the dairy farm where cows knew her hands, the communications room where she could decode German desperation faster than anyone. The man who cried at night and pretended in the morning that everything was fine. Neither place was home. Both places were. On December 20th, she told him her decision. I'll go to Hamburg first. I need to see her, need to know she's really alive, not just words on paper 6 months old. She paused, committed. Then I'll decide. He nodded, didn't ask for more. That night, he gave her an envelope. Don't open it until you're on the ship, he said. Inside, she would discover later, was $400 in cash, 3 years of combat pay saved and hoarded, his address in Charleston, and a letter written in that precise mechanical handwriting, come home when you're ready. Or don't. But know that there's a place here if you need it. No obligations, no debts, just a place if you want it. TB. The money represented everything he'd saved, every penny from 3 years of war. He gave it to her without conditions, without strings. As if letting her go required an offering large enough to match the weight of what he was releasing. Liesl packed her few belongings on January 7th. The clothes she'd arrived in now clean and mended. Her mother's letters tied with string. The photograph someone had taken at the dairy farm, her standing next to a Holstein, almost smiling, though she didn't remember feeling happy when it was taken. And the wool gloves, child-sized, precious beyond their material worth. The truck came at 0600. Cold morning stars still visible, breath-forming clouds in air that felt warm compared to what was coming. Brenneman stood on the porch as she climbed into the truck bed with 5 other women being processed for repatriation. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching. She looked back once, saw him still standing there, a figure growing smaller as the truck rumbled down the red clay road, until the truck turned a corner and he disappeared behind pine trees. The last thing she heard was the crow calling from the magnolia tree, harsh and lonely and strangely final, like a punctuation mark on a chapter that was ending, whether anyone was ready or not. Hamburg in January 1946 was a city that had forgotten how to be a city. Liesl stepped off the train at what remained of the Hauptbahnhof and found only half a station. The roof was gone. The western platforms were craters. People moved through ruins like ghosts, gray-faced and silent, carrying bundles wrapped in newspaper because suitcases were long since traded for food. The Red Cross worker who checked her papers was British, young, grimly efficient. Last known address, Bosau Schulterblatt 47. He consulted a map covered in red X's, each X marking a street that no longer existed. That district took heavy damage. Building may not be standing. My mother was there. I have letters. Letters are months old, miss. Check the displaced persons registry. They track survivors. The registry was kept in a church basement that smelled of mildew and unwashed humanity and despair so thick it was almost visible. Hundreds of names on lists tacked to walls. Living, dead, missing, unknown. She found her mother's name under relocated Hartmann Helene housing Schulterblatt survivor at Bromsallee. 12 room 3B. Bromsallee was 2 kilometers north. Liesl walked through streets that had ceased to be streets and become obstacle courses of rubble. Buildings leaned against each other like drunks supporting drunks. Children played in bombed-out basements, their laughter strange and wrong in all this destruction. An old woman sold cigarettes one at a time from a wooden box, her hands shaking from cold or age or both. Nothing moved quickly. Everyone looked hungry. The kind of hunger that had become permanent, carved into faces and posture, and the way people walked slow, conserving energy because there was never enough food to waste calories on hurrying. Number 12 Bromsallee was an apartment building that had lost its top 3 floors to bombs but stubbornly remained standing on its lower 2. Like a man who'd been beheaded but refused to fall down. Liesl climbed stairs that swayed with each step, wood-creaking protests. She knocked on a door held together with wire and hope. A woman answered. 60, maybe older, impossible to tell when everyone looked ancient from malnutrition, suspicious eyes that had learned not to trust. I'm looking for Frau Hartmann, Helena Hartmann. The woman's face changed, suspicion becoming something softer. Liesel, yes. Wait here. She disappeared into the apartment's dim interior. Liesel heard voices, footsteps, then her mother was there. The woman in the letters had been tired but whole. The woman before her now weighed perhaps 80 pounds, every bone visible, skin stretched over skeleton-like paper over wire frame. Her hair was completely white, though she was only 53. Her hands shook constantly, palsy or malnutrition or simply the body's protest against being asked to keep going when it should have been allowed to quit. When she embraced Liesel, it felt like hugging a collection of bird bones wrapped in cloth. Fragile, breakable, already mostly broken. "You came back," her mother whispered against her shoulder. "I told you not to. I told you to stay safe." "I had to see you." They sat in a room that held 2 cots, 1 table, 1 chair, and nothing else. Everything else had been sold or burned for warmth or simply lost in the general catastrophe of Hamburg's destruction. Frau Eckhart, the woman who had answered the door, made ersatz coffee from roasted grain. It tasted like dirt and ashes, but it was hot, and heat was something. Liesel's mother wanted to know everything: where she'd been, how she'd survived. Liesel edited carefully, told her about the farmhouse, the translation work, the dairy farm, didn't mention Brenneman's name, didn't mention the 8 months of ambiguous captivity that had somehow become the safest she'd felt since the war began, didn't mention that she had a choice to make. Her mother listened, nodded, asked only one question that mattered. "Will you stay?" Liesel looked around the room, at the walls with gaps where bricks had fallen out, at the ceiling where she could see daylight through holes, at her mother's hands that never stopped trembling. "I don't know," she said honestly. That night, sleeping on a cot that smelled of mold and decades of other people's desperation, listening to her mother's labored breathing in the darkness, Liesel understood what Brenneman had been trying to tell her. Germany was dying. Not the dramatic death of combat, but the slow death of starvation and cold and buildings that collapsed 1 brick at a time. Her mother was alive, but barely. Frau Eckhart had lost everything: son, home, future, and lived on charity and rutabagas, and the thin hope that tomorrow might be slightly less terrible than today. This was what winning looked like from the losing side. This was defeat's true face. 3 days later, Liesel went to the market wanting to buy her mother real food. She brought American dollars, a tiny fraction of what Brenneman had given her, but enough to buy bread and maybe meat if any could be found. The woman at the bread stall saw the money, saw Liesel's clean clothes, not new but not rags either. Made the calculation instantly. "Where'd you get American money?" "I was in a POW camp. They paid for work." The woman's face hardened like concrete setting. "Paid you? While our men died in Russian camps eating snow while we starved here. I didn't choose, you chose to survive while we chose to stay. Some of us had honor." She refused to sell the bread. Liesel tried another stall, same response. By the 4th stall, people were staring, whispering. A man spat near her feet, not quite at her, but the message was clear. "Ami Schlampe," someone muttered. "American slut." Liesel walked back to Bramseli with no food and the understanding settling in her stomach like stones: she would never be welcome here. The people who had stayed, who had suffered, who had eaten grass and buried their children in rubble. They would never forgive those who had gone away and come back fed. The crime wasn't leaving. The crime was surviving when so many hadn't. That night she wrote 2 letters. The first to her mother, though they shared a room. She would leave it when she left because some things were easier written than spoken. "Mutti, I love you. I will send money every month, enough for food and medicine. I will visit when I can. But I cannot stay here. This city wants me dead for the crime of being alive. You told me to stay in America if it was safer. You were right. You were trying to save me even then. Forgive me. Your daughter." The second letter she wrote to an address in Charleston, South Carolina, USA. "Captain Brenneman, you offered me a choice. I'm choosing, but not on your terms. If I come back, it won't be as your employee or your replacement daughter or whatever else you need me to be. I come back as myself. Liesl Hartmann, German, survivor, war criminal to some collaborator to others, neither to myself. You said you don't know what I am to you. I don't know either, but I know what I'm not. I'm not Clara. I'm not your son. I'm not absolution for your grief or your guilt or your loneliness. If I return, we start as strangers who share a history. Nothing owed, no claims, no belonging, no possession, equals or nothing. If you can accept that, write to me at the Red Cross office in Hamburg. Tell me to come home. Tell me there's a place, not your place, but a place. Tell me I can build something that's mine. If you can't accept that, don't write. I'll understand. I'll find another way forward. Either way, thank you. For the broth, for the tea, for the gloves, for standing between me and the knife, for letting me go even though it cost you everything you'd saved. LH. She posted it January 15th. The mail system was barely functioning, more hope than infrastructure, but the Red Cross promised it would reach America eventually. Then she waited. The reply came March 3rd, 2 months. Liesl had almost given up, had started looking into work with British occupation forces, translation, secretarial, anything that would let her send money to her mother without having to stay in a city that hated her for surviving. The envelope was thick American paper, Charleston postmark. Her hands shook opening it. Inside a single page in that precise mechanical handwriting she knew as well as her own. Liesl equals. There's a room for rent on King Street. Landlady is Mrs. Chen. Fair rates. She knows you're coming. The telegraph office downtown is hiring civilian operators. I gave you a reference. Job is yours if you want it. Pay is union scale. You'll have your own money, your own place, your own life. I'm being transferred to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I leave in 2 weeks, so I won't be in Charleston to complicate things. You can build whatever you need to build without me hovering. But I'll visit if you want. On leave. We can figure out what this is, what we are. No promises, no claims, just two people trying to figure out how to be alive after everything. Come home when you're ready, or don't, but know that the place exists. It's real, it's waiting. And it's yours, not mine, Thaddeus. She read it 5 times, looking for traps, for hidden claim, for the possession disguised as freedom. Found none. Just honesty, just equals. She booked passage for April, used half of Brenneman's money for the ticket, sent the other half to her mother with instructions: food, first medicine, second warmth, third save nothing, use it all. More would come. Her mother cried when Liesl told her the plan, but the tears were relief, not grief. You're choosing life, her mother said, holding her with those bird-bone arms. I can't be angry at that. I won't be. I'll send money every month. I know you will. I'll visit when I can. I know. Her mother pulled back, looked at her with eyes that were still sharp despite everything. But Liesl, don't come back because of guilt. Come back if you want to. Or don't come back at all. Just live. Promise me you'll live. I promise. On April 19, 1946, Liesl boarded a ship in Hamburg harbor. The city was still ruins behind her, would be ruins for years, maybe decades. Some things took longer to rebuild than others. She didn't look back. Looking back was how you turned into salt, into stone, into something frozen in the past and unable to move forward. The Atlantic crossing took 9 days. She spent most of them on deck watching the horizon, trying to imagine what equals meant in practice. Trying to believe it was possible to build something new from pieces of something broken. The ship docked in Charleston April 28th. Brenneman was waiting on the dock. Not in uniform civilian clothes, khaki pants, and a white shirt. No insignia to mark him as captain or captor or anything but a man. He looked smaller somehow, more human, less the iron control that had defined him in Georgia. They stood 3 feet apart for a long moment. 2 people who had shared 8 months and a war and griefs they couldn't fully name. You came back, he said. I came back. As equals. As equals. He nodded slowly. I rented you a room like I said. Downtown near the telegraph office. Mrs. Chen's expecting you. They want you to start Monday if you're ready. Not working for you. No, I told you I'm transferring to Fort Bragg next week. You won't have to see me unless you want to. She felt something drop in her stomach. Unexpected. What if I want to? The question surprised them both. Brenneman's face did something complicated, relief and fear and hope all tangled together. Then I'll visit, on leave. Weekends, maybe. We can... He paused. We can figure it out, whatever this is. Whatever this is, she echoed. They figured it out slowly. Through letters first because distance made honesty easier. Then weekend visits when he could get leave. Long walks through Charleston where they talked about small things, weather work, the price of bread, and carefully avoided the big things until they couldn't avoid them anymore. He proposed in December 1947, not romantic, just practical. Makes the immigration paperwork easier, he said. If you want, no pressure. But the war bride visa is simpler than employment visa, and we're... He gestured vaguely at the space between them. We're this, whatever this is. She wanted, despite everything, despite the ambiguity, despite not knowing if this was love or convenience or just two broken people building something from their shared brokenness. They married February 1948. Small ceremony. Judge in Charleston. Two witnesses pulled from the courthouse hallway who had no idea what they were witnessing. It wasn't love, not the kind from storybooks or movies or the lies people told themselves. It was something stranger and more durable. Two people who had survived different wars building something from the pieces that remained. They had no children, never discussed why. Some wounds don't heal enough to create new life, and neither of them wanted to examine too closely whether the wound was physical or emotional or simply the understanding that bringing a child into a world that had taken their other children seemed like tempting fate. Instead, they built a business, telegraph supply company, sold equipment to military bases and shipping companies. Liesel handled technical specifications and client relations. Brenneman managed logistics and military contracts. They were good at it, better together than either would have been apart. Years passed. The business grew. They moved to Savannah, not Georgia plantation country, not Charleston with its ghosts, just Savannah with its squares and its moss and its careful distance from the past. They never talked about the 8 months in Georgia. Never acknowledged the locked drawer or the crying at night or the moment when he'd said, "You belong to me," and meant it with every fibre of his being. Some things were better left in the past, buried under years of routine and success and the comfortable distance that time provided. But once in 1963, Liesel found him in the garage going through old boxes. He held a small photograph, Clara and the boy who had been 8 when he died. "I'm throwing them away," he said. Not defensive, just stating fact. Why? Because I don't need them anymore. I remember without them. He looked at her. Is that wrong? No. She took the photo, looked at it for the first time in 15 years. It's not wrong, it's just done. Yeah. He took it back, placed it in the box marked for disposal. Done. They never spoke of it again. 1985. The nursing home in Savannah smelled of disinfectant and old age and institutional food. Not bad food, just food cooked in quantities too large for love. Liesel was 62. Brenneman was 76, body bent by Parkinson's that had started 5 years prior, turning his precise movements into tremors he couldn't control. They shared a room. Not romantic, just practical. Cheaper than 2 rooms, easier for the staff, and after 37 years of marriage, they'd earned the right to define their own arrangements. The graduate student was young Ernest, working on her dissertation about German POWs in America. She'd found Liesel through military records and Red Cross archives. "Mrs. Brenneman, can you describe your experience as a prisoner of war?" Liesel looked at Thaddeus in his wheelchair by the window. His hands trembled in his lap, but his eyes were clear. He gave a tiny nod. Permission, or maybe just curiosity about what she would say. "I was kept in a farmhouse in Georgia. I worked as a translator. I was fed. I was protected. I was not free. Were you coerced? Define coerced. Liesel's voice was sharper than she intended, softened it. I was given choices, but when your choices are work for this man or starve in a camp where other prisoners might kill you for collaborating. How free is that choice? The student scribbled notes. But you married him. Yes. So it became more than coercion. Liesel was quiet for a long moment, looking at the man who had been her captor, her employer, her husband, who had given her his son's gloves and his life's savings and finally, eventually, something like freedom. I don't know what it became, she said honestly. I know what it wasn't. It wasn't love at first sight. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even friendship at first. It was necessary. For both of us. Can you explain? He had lost his family. He was desperate for something to protect someone to keep safe. I was desperate for protection. We used each other. But somewhere in that using we became real to each other, people, not just needs. By the time I had a true choice to leave, when I could have stayed in Hamburg or gone anywhere, I chose to come back. Not because I loved him, because I understood him and he understood me, and understanding felt more valuable than love. Was it worth it, giving up your freedom? I didn't give up freedom. I traded one cage for another. In Germany, I would have been caged by poverty and hatred. Here I was caged by... She paused, looking for the right word. By gratitude, by debt, by the weight of being saved. And now, looking back. Liesel thought about the drawer that Brenneman had finally emptied in 1963. About the mornings when his Parkinson's made feeding himself impossible and she fed him with the same patience he'd once used, bringing her broth when she was too sick to keep down solid food. About the business they'd built, the life they'd constructed from broken pieces. Now I think war makes honest people into liars, she said carefully. We tell ourselves stories to survive. I told myself I had a choice. He told himself he was protecting me. Both stories were true. Both were lies. The truth is we saved each other by accident, and we've been trying to figure out what that means ever since. The student closed her notebook. Thank you for your honesty. After she left, Liesel wheeled Brenneman to the window. Outside, Savannah was green and warm and utterly indifferent to their small drama. Did I say it right? She asked. His voice was weak but clear. You said it perfectly. Do you regret it, any of it? He thought for a long time. I regret not knowing what else I could have done, should have done, but I don't regret that you're here. Even though I was your prisoner, you were never just my prisoner. He paused. Though you were that too. Both things can be true. They sat in silence, watching the world outside continue its business of living and dying and rebuilding and breaking again. Thaddeus. Thank you. For what? For letting me go, even when you didn't want to. I didn't let you go. You went anyway. He smiled slightly. I just didn't stop you. That's not the same thing. No, she agreed. It's not. But maybe she thought maybe the difference between letting someone go and not stopping them was the difference between freedom and captivity. Maybe she'd never been truly free, not in Georgia, not in Hamburg, not even now. Maybe freedom was more complicated than the absence of chains. Maybe freedom was the space between you belong to me and come home when you're ready. The space where choice lived even when all the choices were terrible. That night in the nursing home room that smelled of medicine and age and the slow dissolution of bodies that had lasted longer than they were designed to. Liesel helped Brenneman into bed, tucked the blanket around him with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Daughter care or wife care or just care, undefined and undefinable. Liesel, yes. I loved you, eventually. I want you to know that. It took years, but I did. I do. She smoothed his white hair, so different from the dark-haired captain who had stood on a Georgia porch 39 years ago. I know. I loved you too, in my way. Was it enough? She thought about that, about Hamburg in ruins and Georgia red clay and all the years between. about cows and typewriters and the sound of a drawer opening and closing in the night. "It was what we had," she said finally, "so it had to be enough." He closed his eyes, breathing steady, almost asleep. Liesel sat in the chair beside his bed, looking at her own hands, old hands now spotted and thin-skinned. But they were hers, had always been hers even when she'd believed they belonged to him. The war had ended 40 years ago, but for them it had never quite ended. Just changed shape, became smaller, more manageable, something they could live with instead of something that killed them. She closed her eyes and let memory take her back, to magnolia trees and red clay, to the moment when a man had said, "You work for me now," and she'd stepped into a future she couldn't have imagined. To the slow transformation from prisoner to employee to something that had no name because war had erased the vocabulary for what they'd become. She had survived. They both had. And survival in the end was its own kind of victory. Even if you spent 40 years wondering what exactly you'd won. Epilogue, 1987. Thaddeus Brenneman died on a Tuesday in March, peaceful, in his sleep. The Parkinson's had finally taken the last things it could take. Movement, speech, the ability to swallow. But it had left him his mind until the end, which was either mercy or cruelty depending on how you looked at it. Liesel held his hand until the trembling stopped, until the breath stopped, until the man who had been captor and husband and something undefined became just a body empty of whatever had animated it. At the funeral, she met people she'd never seen before. His sister from Iowa. Liesel hadn't known he had a sister, a cousin, friends from his time in North Africa who told stories about a man she barely recognized. They spoke of him as if he'd been simple, a good soldier, a decent husband. None of them knew about the drawer, about the crying, about the desperate need that had looked like possession and might actually have been love. Just love so twisted by loss it couldn't express itself except through control. She buried him in Savannah. Not Charleston, where Clara and the boy were. Not Hamburg, where nothing from the old world remained. Savannah, where they'd built something from pieces where the neutral ground of their shared life existed. The lawyer read the will. Everything to her as expected. The house, the business, his military pension, and one item specified separately. My personal papers and photographs to be destroyed unread per previous agreement with my wife. That night, Liesel found the box in the basement, labeled in his careful handwriting, private. She could open it, could finally understand what he'd kept locked away all those years, could read the letters he'd written to Clara, could see the photographs of the son she'd never met, could know the full depth of what she'd been compared to. Or she could keep the promise, could let him keep his secrets the way he'd eventually learned to let her keep hers. She carried the box to the fireplace, lit kindling, watched flames catch. Then she fed it in piece by piece, letters, photographs, whatever he'd needed to hide for 40 years. All of it turned to ash without her ever knowing what it contained. Some doors were meant to stay closed. When the fire burned down, she sat in the chair by the window. The same chair she'd sat in 1,000 times. Watching him pace, watching him work, watching him age into someone gentler than the captain with iron control. Outside Savannah bloomed with spring, azaleas and dogwoods and magnolias, always magnolias. Their white flowers glowing in darkness like they had that first night in Georgia, when she'd stepped off a truck into a future that terrified her. Liesel Hartman Brenneman, 64 years old, survivor of 2 countries and one very complicated marriage, whispered to the empty room. "You never owned me, but you saved me, and I saved you. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be enough." The room didn't answer. Rooms never did. But somewhere in the silence between what was said and what was meant, between captivity and freedom, between you're mine and I'm yours, she found something like peace. Not forgiveness. She hadn't done anything that needed forgiving. And neither had he really beyond the crime of being human and broken and trying to survive. Not closure, some things don't close, they just become part of the landscape you learn to navigate. Just acceptance. Of what had been, of what she had chosen, of the cost of survival when survival meant surrendering pieces of yourself you could never get back. The war was over, had been over for 42 years. Their war, the private one fought in farmhouses and nursing homes, and the space between protection and possession, that war was finally over too. And the magnolia tree outside the window bloomed indifferent and beautiful the way the world always bloomed after endings. The way it would bloom long after everyone who remembered was gone. The way it bloomed for survivors and the dead alike, making no distinction, asking no questions, just blooming, because that's what magnolias did in March in Savannah, Georgia, where the clay was red and the history was complicated and some stories had no easy answers. Only endings, only memory. Only the slow accumulation of years that turned even the sharpest pain into something bearable. She fell asleep in the chair, one hand resting on the wooden arm worn smooth by decades of use, the other holding the wool gloves she'd kept for 40 years, child-sized. Stretched from use, the last thing an 8-year-old boy had touched before the world ended for him. She had never told Brenneman she'd kept them. Some gifts were too heavy to acknowledge, but she'd kept them anyway, because throwing them away would have been its own kind of dishonesty. And if there was one thing she'd learned in 40 years, it was that honesty, brutal, complicated, uncomfortable honesty, was the only foundation strong enough to build a life on, even a life built from pieces of other people's broken ones. Even a life that started as captivity and ended as something that might, if you squinted, look like freedom.